Sometimes, the people we think we're saving are the ones sent to save us. The rain came down in long, steady lines, cold enough to sting the skin and quiet enough to make the world feel abandoned. And along a narrow back road winding through the dark hills of northern Montana, Ethan Cole drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting absently on the thick fur of his dog, Scout, who sat upright in the passenger seat like a sentry watching a forgotten border, the old pickup rattling beneath them as if it, too, was tired of carrying the weight of years and silence. And for a while there was nothing but the hum of tires against wet pavement and the soft rhythm of rain tapping against the windshield, until something shifted, not in the road, but in the air itself, a feeling Ethan couldn't quite name, but had learned long ago not to ignore, and beside him Scout went still, ears lifting, body tightening, amber eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the narrow shoulder, listening in a way that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with instinct. "You hear that?" Ethan murmured, though he already knew the answer, because Scout didn't move unless something mattered. And then it came, faint and distant, barely more than a whisper beneath the rain, a hollow metallic chime, like a bell stirred by a hand no one could see. Once, then silence, then again, softer, almost patient, as if waiting to be noticed, and Scout let out a low breath, not quite a bark, not quite a growl, but something older, something that reached deeper than training, and without another thought Ethan eased the truck onto the gravel shoulder, the tires crunching as he killed the engine and stepped out into the cold, the rain soaking through his flannel in seconds, the smell of wet pine and iron filling his lungs as he listened, really listened. And there it was again, the faint echo threading through the trees, guiding rather than calling, and Scout was already moving, paused silent against the mud as he slipped past the edge of the road and into the dark forest, not hesitating, not looking back, just trusting the path as if he had walked it before, and Ethan followed, boots sinking into the softened earth, branches brushing against his shoulders as the world behind him faded into nothing but shadow and rain. The beam of his flashlight cutting a narrow tunnel through the darkness, catching glimpses of slick bark and drifting mist, until the ground dipped suddenly and the sound of water grew louder, a shallow creek running fast beneath the storm. And there, half hidden against the slope, lay a figure. An old man collapsed near the edge of the bank, his coat soaked through, one hand still clutching something metallic that glinted faintly in the light. And Scout stopped a few feet away, not barking, just standing watch, as if this moment had been waiting longer than either of them understood. And Ethan moved quickly, kneeling beside the man, feeling for breath, for warmth, for any sign that he hadn't come too late. And when the old man's chest rose in a shallow, fragile rhythm, something in Ethan's own chest eased, just slightly, like a door opening a fraction after years of being shut. "Hey, stay with me," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the cold, despite the weight of memories that usually followed him like shadows. And for a brief second, as the rain softened and the wind shifted through the trees, it almost felt as if the forest itself was listening, holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next, because sometimes the smallest choices, made in the quietest moments, are the ones that change everything. The old man's breath came in shallow waves, each one thinner than the last, as if the cold had slowly been stealing it away. And Ethan worked quickly but without panic, the way he had been trained years ago when hesitation could cost more than time, shrugging off his own jacket and wrapping it around the man's shoulders, pulling him carefully away from the edge of the creek where the ground had begun to give under the weight of the rain. "Easy now. You are all right," he said, his voice low and steady, more for himself than for the stranger. And Scout stepped closer, lowering his head as if to study the man's face, his ears flicking once toward the trees behind them before settling again, alert but calm, as though whatever had led them here had already passed. And when Ethan reached for the object still clutched in the man's hand, he felt resistance, not strength, but intention, fingers curled tightly around a small iron key, old and worn smooth by time, its surface cold even through the rain. "Hold on to it," Ethan murmured, easing his hand back, sensing that whatever that key meant, it mattered enough to keep. And with a careful shift he lifted the man, feeling how light he was, like someone who had already begun to let go of the world piece by piece. And the walk back to the truck was slow, each step deliberate through mud and roots and the steady whisper of rain against the leaves. But Scout moved ahead without hesitation, guiding them along the narrow path as if the darkness held no confusion for him at all. And by the time they reached the roadside, the storm had begun to soften, the drops falling lighter now, almost hesitant, like a story reaching the end of its first telling. And Ethan eased the man into the passenger seat, climbing in beside him and turning the heater on full, the engine rumbling to life as warm air slowly pushed back against the chill, filling the cab with the faint scent of dust and worn leather. And for a moment he simply sat there, watching the man's chest rise and fall, counting each breath the way he used to count seconds in the silence before something broke. And then, without opening his eyes, the old man spoke, his voice thin but clear enough to carry weight. "You heard it too," he said, not as a question, but as a quiet certainty. And Ethan hesitated, glancing at Scout, who now sat still again, gaze fixed forward as if nothing had happened at all. "He heard it first," Ethan replied, nodding toward the dog, and the old man's lips curved faintly, almost a smile. "Good," he whispered. "Then you will know where to go." And before Ethan could ask what that meant, the man's hand shifted slightly, loosening just enough for the key to slip into Ethan's palm, its cold metal pressing into his skin like something more than an object, something that carried a memory or a promise he did not yet understand. And outside, the rain slowed to a hush, the clouds beginning to break just enough to let a pale sliver of moonlight fall across the road ahead. And in that quiet, with the storm fading and the world holding still for a breath longer than it should have, Ethan felt it again. That same unspoken pull, not fear, not urgency, but something deeper, something that did not ask for belief, only for a willingness to follow. And as he looked down at the key resting in his hand, worn and silent, yet somehow alive with meaning, he realized that whatever had begun in the rain was not finished, it was only just beginning. The road stretched ahead in a thin ribbon of pale gray under the fading storm, and for a long while Ethan drove without speaking, his hands steady on the wheel, while the heater hummed softly against the cold that still clung to his bones, the old man resting beside him with his eyes closed, his breathing quieter now, but still there, still present in a way that felt fragile and important, like something that could not be rushed or questioned. And Scout sat between them, not in his usual upright posture, but lower, watchful, his gaze shifting now and then toward the windshield as if following something just beyond sight. And every so often his ears would flick, not in alarm, but in recognition, as though the world outside the truck was speaking in a language only he understood. And Ethan felt it again, that quiet pull in his chest, not pressure, not fear, but direction, subtle and steady, like a current beneath still water, guiding rather than forcing. And after several miles the old man stirred, his hand brushing faintly against the worn seat before settling again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not the highway," he said, and Ethan glanced at him, surprised not by the words but by the certainty behind them. "Take the ridge road," the man added, and there was no map, no sign, nothing in the darkness ahead that suggested such a turn even existed. Yet something in the way he spoke made Ethan slow the truck, scanning the roadside until, just as the headlights shifted slightly to the left, a narrow dirt path revealed itself between two leaning pines, half hidden, almost forgotten, as if it had been waiting to be noticed. And without fully deciding to do so, Ethan turned the wheel, the tires crunching over gravel as they left the main road behind, climbing slowly upward into the hills where the trees grew thicker and the silence deeper. And the farther they went, the quieter everything became, the sound of the storm fading into memory until even the wind seemed to hold back. And after what felt like miles but could have been less, the path leveled out, opening into a small clearing where the ground was softer, untouched. And there, at the edge of the headlights, stood something that did not belong to the night, a wooden post, weathered and worn, with a rusted lantern hanging from its side, swaying gently despite the still air. And Scout let out a low breath, stepping forward before the truck had fully stopped, his paws silent as he approached the post, nose lifting slightly, as if catching a scent that carried more than time. And Ethan followed, the old man remaining still in the passenger seat, not asleep, not awake, simply present in a way that felt distant yet certain. And when Ethan reached the post, he noticed a small marking carved into the wood, faint but deliberate, the outline of a mountain peak with a narrow path etched along its side, and beneath it, barely visible, a symbol that matched the shape of the key now resting in his pocket. And for a moment he stood there, the quiet wrapping around him like a question waiting for an answer, until behind him the truck's engine idled softly and the old man spoke again, his voice carrying through the stillness without effort. "He will lead you from here." And Ethan turned, his eyes meeting Scout's as the dog looked back at him, not waiting, not questioning, simply knowing. And in that moment Ethan understood something he could not explain, that whatever road he had been on before this night no longer mattered, because the path ahead had already been chosen, not by chance, but by something patient enough to wait until he was ready to follow. Scout moved first, stepping past the weathered post and into the darkness beyond the clearing with a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt, and Ethan followed without calling him back, his boots pressing into the damp earth as the forest seemed to close gently around them, not threatening, not welcoming, just present in a way that felt older than the road they had left behind. And with each step the air shifted, carrying a faint scent of pine resin and cold stone, the kind of smell that lingered in places untouched for years. And somewhere deeper within the trees, that same soft metallic chime echoed again, not louder, but clearer now, as if distance had been replaced by direction. And Scout paused only once, turning his head slightly as if checking that Ethan was still there, then continued forward along a narrow trail that revealed itself only when he stepped onto it, a path not marked by signs or tracks, but by a subtle absence of resistance, like something had passed this way many times before. And after several minutes the ground began to rise, the incline gradual but steady, leading them higher into the ridge where the trees thinned just enough to allow pale moonlight to filter through, casting long shadows that moved with the breeze. And Ethan felt the key in his pocket with every step, its weight small but impossible to ignore, as if it carried more than metal, as if it remembered where it belonged. And when the trees finally opened, it was not sudden, but quiet, the way a curtain might lift without a sound, revealing a structure set back against the slope of the mountain. A lodge built of dark timber and stone, its outline softened by time but still standing with a kind of quiet dignity, as though it had been waiting rather than abandoned. And Scout slowed as they approached, his movements careful now, his ears forward, his body alert in a way that was not fear but recognition. And Ethan stopped a few feet from the front steps, taking in the details that did not quite fit the idea of a place left behind. The windows were dark but intact, the porch swept clean of debris despite the storm, and the lantern hanging by the door swayed gently, though there was no wind strong enough to move it. And for a moment he simply stood there, listening, not for sound, but for the same feeling that had guided him this far. And it was there, steady and quiet, like a presence that did not need to be seen to be understood. And behind him the forest remained still, the path they had taken already blending back into shadow as if it had never existed at all. And when Ethan finally stepped forward, placing his foot on the first wooden plank of the porch, it did not creak under his weight, but held firm, as though it had expected him. And Scout moved ahead to the door, sitting down beside it without command, his gaze fixed on the handle. And Ethan reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the cold iron key, feeling its worn edges press into his skin as he brought it into the light. And for a brief second, just before he raised it toward the lock, he hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because something inside him understood that whatever waited on the other side of that door was not just a place, it was an answer, and answers, once found, had a way of changing everything. Ethan did not rush the moment, his hand steady as he brought the iron key toward the lock, the metal catching a faint glimmer of moonlight before sliding into place with a quiet, certain fit, as if it had never belonged anywhere else. And when he turned it, there was no resistance, only a soft click that echoed deeper than the door itself, something final, yet welcoming, and the handle gave beneath his grip, the door opening inward with a slow, measured motion that revealed not darkness, but a dim, steady glow from within. A single oil lamp resting on a wooden table just inside, its flame flickering gently as though it had been waiting patiently through the years. and Scout rose at once, stepping across the threshold without hesitation, his posture alert but calm, moving through the room with quiet familiarity, his paws making almost no sound against the worn floorboards, and Ethan followed, pausing just inside the doorway as the scent of aged wood and faint cedar wrapped around him, warm in a way that contrasted the cold night behind. And for a moment he simply stood there, listening, not for danger, but for anything that might explain how a place like this could exist untouched, lit, and ready, as if time had chosen to pass it by. And the room itself was simple but carefully kept, a stone fireplace along one wall, stacked logs beside it as though someone had arranged them only days before, a wool blanket folded neatly over the back of a chair, and a set of boots placed by the door, their soles clean despite the storm outside. And something about it all felt less like abandonment and more like pause, as though the life here had stepped away only briefly, expecting to return at any moment. And Scout stopped, near the center of the room, lowering his head slightly as he looked toward a narrow hallway that led deeper into the lodge, his ears tilting forward, not in alarm, but in quiet attention. And Ethan moved slowly, each step deliberate, his senses sharpening not from fear, but from the weight of something unseen yet undeniable. And as he passed the table, he noticed a small object resting beside the lamp, a folded piece of paper, aged but clean, its edges straight, its presence intentional, and he reached for it without thinking, unfolding it carefully to reveal a single line written in steady, deliberate script. "You followed, so now you will understand." And the words settled into him in a way he could not explain, not as a message from a stranger, but as something that had been waiting specifically for him. And behind him the door remained open, the night air still and quiet, while ahead the hallway seemed to draw the light inward, guiding rather than hiding. And Scout took a few steps forward before pausing again, glancing back just once as if to be sure Ethan was ready. And in that silent exchange, something shifted inside him, not a question, not hesitation, but a quiet acceptance that whatever this place was, whatever it held, it had not been found by accident. And as he folded the note and slipped it into his pocket beside the key, Ethan realized that the path he had chosen to follow in the rain had not only led him to this door, it had led him to a threshold far greater than wood and stone, one that did not simply open into a room, but into a truth he had not yet begun to see. Scout moved first into the hallway, his steps slow and measured, his body aligned with a purpose that did not need to be spoken. And Ethan followed, the soft glow from the oil lamp behind them stretching into long shadows that seemed to reach forward as if guiding rather than fading. And the air grew warmer as they moved deeper into the lodge, carrying a faint scent of cedar and something older, something like paper and time, the kind of smell found in places where stories had been kept longer than they were told. And the hallway opened into a larger room, one that felt less like a living space and more like a memory preserved, with shelves lining the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with books, journals, and small wooden boxes, each placed with care, each untouched by dust. And in the center of the room stood a heavy oak desk, its surface clear except for a single object resting at its edge, a leather-bound journal, worn at the corners but intact, as though it had been opened and closed many times over the years. And Scout approached it quietly, lowering his head slightly before stepping aside, not touching it, not disturbing it, simply acknowledging its presence. And Ethan hesitated only for a moment before reaching out, his fingers brushing the cover, feeling the texture of something that had endured. And when he opened it, the pages revealed neat, deliberate handwriting, each line steady, each word placed with intention. And though he had not expected it, the first entry carried a date from decades earlier, followed by a name he recognized without being told, Silas Reed, written in a hand that matched the note he now carried in his pocket. And as Ethan read, the words unfolded not as a simple record, but as a quiet reflection of a life spent watching, waiting, and preparing, entries that spoke of the mountain, of the lodge, of a belief that certain paths were not chosen by chance, but revealed when the right moment arrived. And scattered among the pages were mentions of travelers, strangers who had come and gone, some lost, some searching, but none who had followed through, none who had listened long enough to hear what the silence was offering. and Ethan felt something shift inside him as he turned each page. Not confusion, but recognition. As though the story written there was not entirely separate from his own, and behind him, the faint sound of the door at the front of the lodge closing drifted through the space, soft and final, though he had not heard it move, and Scout lifted his head at the sound, his ears tilting back briefly before settling again, calm but aware, and when Ethan reached the final page, the handwriting changed slightly, less formal, more immediate, as though it had been written not long ago, and the words were simple, yet carried a weight that settled deep. If you are reading this, then you heard it too, and you chose to follow, not because you were told, but because something within you refused to ignore it. This place is not mine to keep. It never was. It belongs to the one who arrives without expectation and stays without fear. And Ethan closed the journal slowly, his hand resting on its cover as the silence around him deepened. Not empty, but full in a way that did not need explanation. And in that stillness, he understood that the man he had found in the rain had not been waiting to be saved. He had been waiting to pass something on, something far greater than shelter, something that could not be seen, only felt. And as Scout stepped closer, sitting beside him with quiet loyalty, Ethan realized that the path ahead was no longer uncertain. It was simply unfolding, one quiet step at a time. The silence that followed felt different now, no longer uncertain or questioning, but settled, as if the lodge itself had accepted something that had been long awaited, and Ethan remained standing beside the desk for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly on the closed journal while the weight of its words continued to unfold inside him, not all at once, but slowly, like light seeping into a room that had been dark for too long. And beside him Scout shifted slightly, his presence steady and grounding, his breathing calm and even, the kind of quiet companionship that did not need explanation. And as Ethan finally stepped away from the desk, his gaze moved across the room again, noticing details he had not seen before, small carvings along the edges of the shelves, faint markings, etched into the wood that mirrored the symbol on the key, each one placed deliberately, each one part of something larger than decoration. And as he walked further along the wall, his fingers brushing lightly against the spines of the books, he felt an almost imperceptible vibration beneath his touch, subtle but real, like a distant echo carried through the structure itself. And Scout reacted at once, his head lifting, ears forward, his body alert not with fear, but with focus, and without a sound he moved toward the far corner of the room where the wooden floor met a section of exposed stone, his nose lowering, his gaze fixed on a narrow seam that ran along the base of the wall, and Ethan followed, kneeling beside him, his hand pressing gently against the surface. And there it was again, the faint rhythm, steady and measured, like something breathing deep within the mountain. And for a brief moment the memory returned, the pattern of waiting, of listening, of knowing when. Something beneath the surface was not random but intentional, and he closed his eyes, counting without thinking, letting the rhythm guide him. And when he opened them, his focus shifted to a small iron latch set low into the stone, almost hidden unless one knew where to look. And without hesitation he reached into his pocket, his fingers finding the key once more, its presence now familiar, almost expected. And as he brought it to the latch, there was no doubt in his movement, no second thought, only a quiet understanding that this, too, was part of the path he had already chosen. And the key turned with the same ease as before, the mechanism responding as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. And with a soft release, a section of the stone wall shifted inward, revealing a narrow passage descending into darkness, and the air that rose from below was cool and still, carrying that same scent of earth and time, but now stronger, clearer, like something that had been hidden but never forgotten. And Scout stepped forward to the edge of the opening, pausing only briefly before looking back at Ethan, not questioning, not urging, simply waiting. And in that quiet exchange, Ethan felt something settle fully within him, not a decision, but a realization that whatever lay beneath the lodge was not separate from what had brought him here. It was the continuation of it, the next step in a story he had already begun the moment he chose to follow a sound no one else could hear. And as he reached for the lantern on the desk, lifting it carefully and watching the flame steady itself against the movement, he took a single breath, slow and grounded, before stepping toward the passage. Understanding now that some doors do not just open into places, they open into truths that have been waiting long before we are ready to see them. The passage descended in a slow, deliberate curve, the stone steps worn smooth as though shaped by years of quiet footsteps. And Ethan moved carefully, the lantern casting a soft amber glow that pushed back the darkness just enough to reveal the path ahead. While Scout walked a step in front of him, steady and sure, his ears forward, his body aligned with a purpose that no longer needed questioning. And the air grew cooler as they went deeper, carrying a stillness that felt untouched by time. A silence so complete it seemed to hold its own kind of presence. And with each step, the faint rhythm Ethan had felt above became clearer, not louder, but more defined, like a pulse woven into the mountain itself, steady and patient, waiting to be understood rather than discovered. And after what felt longer than the distance should allow, the passage opened into a wide chamber carved naturally into the rock, its ceiling arching high above. The stone walls smooth and pale where the lantern light touched them, and at the center of the space stood something unexpected, not treasure, not machinery, but a simple arrangement. A wooden table placed upon a flat stone platform, and upon it rested a collection of objects, each one carefully positioned, each one preserved as though time had chosen to pause around them. And Ethan stepped closer, his breath steady but deeper now, drawn by something he could not name. And as the light fell across the table, he saw what lay there, a series of envelopes, each sealed and marked with a name, some faded, some clearer, but all written in the same steady hand he had seen in the journal, and beside them, a small metal box, its surface etched with the same mountain symbol, its lid slightly open as though it had been waiting to be looked into. And Scout stopped at the edge of the platform, sitting down quietly, his gaze fixed not on the table, but on Ethan himself, as if this next step was not his to lead, but Ethan's to choose, and slowly, with a calm that surprised even him, Ethan reached for the box, lifting the lid fully to reveal what it held, not gold, not anything of material worth, but a bundle of documents, carefully tied, along with a single folded letter placed on top. And when he opened it, the paper felt familiar, the same texture as the note he had found upstairs, and the words written there were clear and simple, yet carried a weight that settled deep within him. What you hold is not given, it is entrusted. This place has always belonged to the one who listens when others walk away. The lodge, the land, and all that rests within it are now yours, not because you sought them, but because you did not turn away when it would have been easier to do so. And Ethan read the words slowly, not rushing, letting each line settle, and as he did, the rhythm in the stone beneath his feet seemed to soften, not fading, but shifting, like something that had completed its purpose. And behind him, the passage remained open, the path back still there, yet no longer calling. And in that moment, standing beneath the weight of the mountain, with Scout beside him and the quiet certainty of the place surrounding him, Ethan understood that what had brought him here had never been about finding something hidden. It had been about becoming the one who could receive it. And as he lowered the letter, his hand steady, his breath even, the silence around him felt different once more, not waiting now, but resting, as though something long held had finally been passed on, and the mountain, in its quiet way, had simply been keeping its promise. The climb back to the surface felt shorter, though Ethan knew the distance had not changed, the lantern in his hand steady as its light guided each step upward, and Scout moved beside him now instead of ahead. His pace matched, his presence no longer leading but accompanying, as if the path no longer needed to be found, only walked. And when they emerged into the main room of the lodge, the air felt warmer than before, not just in temperature, but in something less tangible, something that settled quietly into the space like a breath finally released. And Ethan set the lantern back on the table, its flame flickering once before becoming still, casting a soft glow across the wooden walls and the objects that now felt less like mysteries and more like parts of something whole. And for a moment he simply stood there, listening, not for the distant rhythm that had guided him before, but for the silence that followed it, a silence that no longer felt empty, but complete. And outside, the faintest light had begun to touch the edges of the windows, the first hint of morning rising slowly over the ridge, and Scout moved toward the door, pausing beside it as he had before, but this time without tension, without that focused alertness, only a calm readiness. And Ethan followed, opening the door to let the cool morning air drift in, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The storm now fully passed, leaving the world quiet and clear, and the clearing beyond the lodge looked unchanged, yet somehow different, as if the night had reshaped it in ways that could not be seen, only felt. And as Ethan stepped out onto the porch, the horizon stretched before him, the mountains layered in soft shades of blue and gray, the sky above them slowly brightening. And for the first time and longer than he could remember, he did not feel the weight of where he had been or the uncertainty of where he might go next, because the path beneath his feet was no longer temporary, no longer something to move through. It was something to remain within. And behind him the lodge stood quiet and steady, not imposing, not claiming, simply there, as if it had always been part of the mountain and now, somehow, part of him as well. And Scout stepped out beside him, sitting at the edge of the porch, his gaze fixed on the rising light, his posture relaxed, his purpose fulfilled in a way that needed no words. And Ethan reached into his pocket, feeling the key still there, its presence no longer heavy with question, but light with understanding. And he realized then that what he had been given was not just a place, not just walls and land.